It's a great pleasure to chair this debate and welcome everyone. The talk will be about is artificial intelligence taking our jobs? Lessons from a survey of UK business leaders. Today's speakers are Dr. Will Hunt, who is a research fellow here at Digit, Dr. Sadipa Sarkar, who is a senior research fellow at the Institute for Employment Research at the University of Warwick, and Professor Chris Warhurst, who I'm sure doesn't need any introduction, yet he's a director of the Institute for Employment Research at the University of Warwick. I'm going to hand it over to Chris for a short introduction of the project, and will then talk you through the presentation.
Well, thank you, Danat, and thank you, Gemma, as well, for introducing this. And thanks as well to the Digit team for organising everything generally. I'm just going to give a kind of brief preamble to the study before Will takes us through the substance. There was a period a few years ago when, as part of my job, still is part of my job, I spend a lot of time in Westminster, and there was a kind of period, a few kind of months, maybe 6 months, where every time I went into a meeting, almost the first question I was asked was, do we have any data on the robots? Because there seemed to be near panic in the UK government, at least, that the robots were coming to take all of our jobs because they'd read a couple of very influential papers. And I had to keep saying that actually no one had got any empirical data on what was happening with AI and the robots, not even the Frey and Osborne team. So we were kind of fortunate when we were asked at IER, and when Will was at IER and Sadipa, by the CIPD to undertake a kind of exploratory study of the impact of this new digital technology on the workplace. And we conducted most of the research, I think, over 2018. I think the study's significance is that it is still one of the very few studies about what is happening in the workplaces that introduce AI. And for that reason, it's at the very least a very good kind of litmus test or finger in the wind to see what is happening. And Will talk a bit more about, obviously, about what the research was finding and some of its context. But what I will do now is just kind of give you a bit of an overview of the structure of the seminar presentation, if you will. So, as usual, it's kind of broken down into a number of things. The first thing really is this debate around the future of work. As I said, you know, in policy circles, it was huge, and there was kind of near panic on that. And I mean, the real, if you want to talk about academics having impact, the Frey and Osborne study really did have impact in that sense. It set the kind of political discourse, and of course, it meant that, you know, the ESRC and other funders were suddenly very willing to look at that. And the future of work as a phrase came back into play, and of course, Digit has been one of the beneficiaries of that. What we want to do, though, is also as a kind of way in context to looking at what we did for CIPD, is just to look at what other researchers are doing and just outline those other approaches as a way, really, of signaling how we were slightly different in our approach to doing that survey. So when we talk about our new technology surveys, it was at the time. And then a couple of sections on some of the findings that we've had from this employer survey. And then finally, to raise a couple of issues around the implications of our research for future studies of AI and the future of work. And with that, I'll hand over to Will.
Hey, thanks, Chris. Thanks for the introduction and introducing what we're going to talk about. So the first thing I want to do was just talk a little bit about the background that this kind of research developed in, and kind of what the debate has been like up to now. So obviously, as Chris has mentioned, there's been considerable debate about the impact that AI is having on the world of work and on jobs, and a lot of discussion about what the future is going to look like. So this has been called, you know, some have called this the second machine age that we're kind of going through. Others have talked about it being another industrial revolution, numbering from sort of anywhere between 4 and 6. And also there was a lot of discussion about this idea of Industry 4.0, that AI, along with other technologies like networking and remote sensing and all sorts of other technologies that can be combined to create new ways of doing things and new ways of producing things. And in this, so obviously, as Chris mentioned, there's a lot of concern about what this is going to do for jobs. And these kinds of concerns about automation are nothing new, really. You know, we've had these kinds of discussions at previous stages of where new digital technologies have kind of come in, and everyone's felt that this is going to revolutionize things. So, for example, just the introduction of personal computers in the 80s, for example, and to some extent they do have an impact. And you know, we've kind of seen these sort of waves happen in the past, but this time it's, you know, there's a lot of discussion that this time it's felt to be different with AI. And people have talked about the idea of technological unemployment, that it's going to replace human workers on a large scale. Even talk about things like the end of work. We might be moving towards some sort of post-work society where the AI and the robots do all the work, and then, you know, we have to work out what we're going to do and how we're going to survive and pay for everything. So this raises a question really about what is it that's different this time with artificial intelligence. So what's different, or some of the developments that have kind of led to this, are that there have been various developments in the field of AI itself, that developers are able to, you know, create more and more clever kind of ways of AI working. There's also been massive improvements in networking and the speed of networking, computational power, things like cloud computing, mean that masses and masses of data can be crunched very quickly. And the availability of the data itself through developments such as, you know, the greater and greater use of the internet to do various things, otherwise called big data. All of this mean that there's much more potential for AI to and systems using these technologies to do things really quickly in almost real time, using data that's, you know, being produced all the time. So and all of this means that computers and robots using artificial intelligence and machine learning can do a much wider range of tasks than previously. So the uses, just, you know, I'm not going to list all the uses, but this ranges from things like chatbots that, you know, we're using all the time, to things like warehouse robots that places like Amazon are starting to use, to things like autonomous vehicles, and potentially factories where you need very few workers, so-called lights out factories. And it also, some of these sort of things are areas where people have seen automation in the past and expect to see automation, but it's also the range of things that AI can potentially do or the scope has increased. So we also see things like AI being used to analyze legal documents. So an area, a professional area where in the past it would have been felt that computers can't automate these kinds of tasks, and other things that, so for another example where AI is being used perhaps quite widely is in various different types of automated hiring systems, things like CV checking and shortlisting. And all of these examples range from what we might call dumb AI to smart AI. So things that use fairly simple algorithms with inputs coming in and decisions being made fairly, you know, in real time, but on fairly sort of simple kind of algorithmic basis, to sort of smart AI, where using things like machine learning, so where they're able to do self-correction and to learn from the inputs. But both kinds of AI have the potential for considerable disruption. And as I've mentioned, so the big concern here is that AI can be used to do all sorts of things, and that's going to mean that there's going to be less demand for human workers. Okay, so just so far, as Chris mentioned, there's really there has started to be some research, but is still, there hasn't been a whole lot of research. And what research there has been tends to fall into two main approaches. So the first approach is econometric forecasting, based on the study by Frey and Osborne, probably the first and most influential of these kinds of studies. So in this kind of approach, first of all, the researchers hold insight workshops where they'll get experts in areas like machine learning and big data to sit around a table to look at occupations and descriptions of occupations and the kinds of skills involved and tasks involved. And then they try and decide whether or not there's a risk of that being automated in the next sort of 10 years or so. They will look at a subset of occupations and assign them to whether or not they could be automated by machine learning and computers using up-to-date software, technology. And then they will feed this data into a machine learning machine and develop an algorithm which they can then apply to the full range of occupations and estimate how many jobs might be at risk over the next 10 years. And then a number of studies have been carried out since their study, basically using more or less either the insights from their original study or using their own insight workshops and using various slightly changing the assumptions about which jobs might be at risk, or whether it's focusing on tasks rather than occupations. And all of these studies come up with quite a wide range of predictions about how many jobs could be at risk of automation, ranging from the 47% in Frey and Osborne's original study, looking at the US labor market, down to around 9% of all jobs in OECD countries being at risk of automation, or a certain level of risk of automation in the next 10 years. The second approach are econometric studies that actually use firm level data to look at what's actually happening in firms. And they usually use they use direct measures on things like employment or what the impacts might be, but they have to use and they also use direct measures of the technology investment. But in most cases, they have to use some sort of proxy measure for digitalization or AI. So these range from things like looking at whether or not employers said they had introduced some kind of machine-based digital technologies, which could include quite a wide range of things, to things like spending on automation services or imports on automation-intensive goods. So while these have the benefit of being able to use objective sort of measures, one of the downsides to this is that it's difficult to know what technologies are being introduced. So basically, overall, it's difficult to know what is actually going on in organizations that introduce AI specifically. And so that was what the aim of our research was. So as Chris mentioned, so the CIPD got in touch and they wanted us to run a bespoke survey looking at employers, what technologies employers were using, and in particular AI. I mean, we were looking at a range of different technologies, but there was a particular interest in AI. And so we surveyed, we designed in collaboration with CIPD, a survey of UK business leaders, which was carried out by YouGov in the summer of 2018. So the sample came from a YouGov panel of UK adults, which has thousands and thousands of members. But the survey specifically focused on those in the panel who were had board level management roles in organizations with 10 or more employees. So we developed the survey with input from CIPD and as a sort of a panel, a steering group of experts. And it was piloted with around 50 business leaders from the YouGov panel. So the final survey achieved 759 respondents. And these, the respondents represented organizations with a broad range of, public and private sector industries, and reflected a wide range of ages, sizes, financial turnover, for example. And the survey was weighted by size and industry. So the survey covered things like recent investments in technology during the previous 5 years. What kinds of technology had they introduced? Who was involved in decisions about introducing the technology and who was involved in implementing the technology? We also asked about what the impact of the technology had been on the business and the organization and staff in different groups. And then finally, we also asked about what their future plans for investment in new technology were. So in our analysis, so just to describe our analysis a little bit. So the research question that we were interested in looking at was, is AI more likely to lead to job destruction or job creation than other technologies? So that was the core question that we wanted to look at. And in terms of, so there are two main measures that we needed to kind of, that we used in the analysis. So the first one is whether or not organizations had introduced some kind of AI-enabled technology in the previous 5 years. So this was whether they had introduced AI, robotic, or automated equipment to undertake a physical task, or whether they had introduced AI, robotic, or automated software to undertake a cognitive or non-physical task. And the concept of AI had been introduced in an earlier question as able to learn from data, reasoning, or self-correction. So, and then the outcome measure that we were interested in was whether or not the technology had led to either job creation. So has the introduction of AI created any jobs in your organization, or if it had led to job destruction. So has the technology eliminated or replaced some jobs in your organization? And in some cases, in any cases where the technology had created and replaced jobs, we asked a follow-up question, which was, has the introduction of the technology led to more or fewer jobs in your organization? And they could answer more, fewer, or about the same. So so we created a second outcome variable, which was whether or not the technology had led to more jobs, fewer jobs, or about the same, or had no change. So the approach to the analysis was we used binary logistic regression, which is a multivariate analysis technique to look, first of all, whether or not there had been job destruction. Second, we reran the analysis, looking at whether or not there had been job creation. And then thirdly, we looked at the job creation and job destruction together using the net change variables. So whether or not the technology had created jobs, destroyed jobs, or had made no change to the number of jobs. And in the analysis, we used a range of control variables to control for differences between the organizations investing in technology. So, we included controls for sector, industry, size, age, and revenue of the organization, and some measures of workforce composition, such as gender, age, and skills. Oh, and we also had a control for previous technology use, so whether or not certain number of staff use computers or handheld devices. Okay, so on the left, what we've got here is the outcome, the main descriptive variables. So just showing basically what technologies people had reported investing in. So as you can see, 25% said that they had introduced some kind of AI, whether it was for physical tasks or for cognitive tasks. And there was 15% had introduced AI for physical tasks, 21% had introduced software for cognitive tasks, and around 11% had introduced both. And you can see some examples of the other kinds of technologies that were reported in this question. And overall, around 82% had introduced some kind of new technology over the previous 5 years. And on the right, what we can see here is the proportion that reported job creation or job destruction, broken down by whether they had introduced AI or any other kind of technology. So around about 46% of respondents who said their firm had introduced AI reported that there had been some job creation as a consequence of that AI. And around 44% said that there had been some job destruction. And as you can see, this is a much higher proportion than that had said there had been job creation or destruction compared to those who had introduced any other form of technology that was listed. And so on the right of that chart, what you can see is when we take into account those who said that there had been job creation and job destruction, you can see that around about a similar proportion said that there had been creation only as those who said there had been destruction only. So around about 22% for each. Okay, so this table just shows the main findings from the regression analyses, basically. And what it shows are the marginal effects of introducing AI on the probability of respondents reporting job creation or job destruction when controlling for all other variables. This is the marginal effect. So it's the effect that introducing AI has on the predicted probability of reporting job creation or job destruction. So, and what this shows is that there's about introducing AI, for those who introduced AI, it increased the probability that they reported job creation by 28.4%. And it increased the, compared to having introduced any other technology. And for the job elimination figure, it increased the probability of reporting job elimination by 26.6%. So this is quite a big effect, really. So it's quite a lot more likely to be associated with job creation or job destruction. And on the right, it shows the findings for the net change effect. So 15 or nearly 16, those who introduced AI were around about 16% more likely to say that there had been just job creation than those who had introduced any other technology, and around about 12% more likely to say that it says net creation, but it should say net destruction there. About 12% more likely to say that there had been job destruction compared to those who had introduced any other technology. Okay, so just returning to the sort of central question that we wanted to look at, will AI take our jobs, or is AI taking our jobs? What we can sort of say from these findings that AI is more likely to be associated with job destruction than other new technologies. However, it's also more likely to be associated with job creation than other technologies. And actually, when we looked at the difference between job creation and job destruction, it was just as likely to be associated with job creation as it was to be associated with job destruction. However, there are, we want to sort of hold our hands up a little bit and sort of highlight, sort of be clear about the limitations of what we can and can't say with this data, basically. And one of although we were able to say what the chances of firms reporting job creation or job destruction were, and we can't actually say how many jobs were created or destroyed within the organization, because it was kind of it's quite hard to do that in the kind of survey that we were the ways in which we were asking the questions. And then the second thing is, because it's just a snapshot survey of people at a particular time, there's a couple of things. Firstly, we can't complete it. There could be some endogeneity going on. So what we mean by that is there could be something else that we're not measuring that is leading to firms introducing AI, and it's also means there's going to be more job destruction. So it might be something to do with something else that means that firms that are likely to have job destruction, for example, decide that they're going to use AI. We also, the other thing is the data uses self-reports. So we're relying on people actually being able to tell us whether or not there was job creation or job destruction, and for that to be accurate. And then the final thing is, obviously, in some cases, it might take quite a long time for some of these effects to occur or to be seen. So having said that, I think there are quite a few other things that can be done with this kind of survey that give us some sort of clues, about what might be going on, or give us some insights in what future research can look at. So one of the things that we looked at was whether or not there were any differences in terms of the skills levels of those affected by the introduction, the job creation or job destruction related to AI. And that's what this chart in the slide here shows the chances of the percentage. This is just a bivariate table chart showing the percentage of those who reported job destruction as a consequence of AI or job creation by skills levels of those most affected. So as you can see, job destruction was more likely to be at the low skilled and to some extent at the high skilled level, whereas job creation tended to be at the high skilled level. So whilst we can't say too much about that because the numbers were quite low at this level of analysis, it gives some ideas of what might be going on and what future research might want to look at. We also were able to look at whether or not there were differences in terms of the type of AI that they had introduced, whether it was equipment or robots using AI, or whether it was software using AI for cognitive tasks. And although they were quite similar, but there did appear to be slightly more chance of reporting job destruction among those who had introduced robots or physical AI. And we were also able to look at, because we asked about why people had introduced the different technologies, we were also able to look at whether or not the motivations for introducing the technology had any impact on the findings. So this was, we ran some analysis of the regression models, including some measure of motivations. We found that those who had introduced AI to reduce costs or to deliver goods or services more cheaply, the effects were stronger, but particularly the destruction effects were stronger. But again, the numbers start to get a bit lower here, so there's not so much that we can say about this. And then that's last, the other way in which, what the survey can kind of give us some insights is that it can give some idea about some of the mechanisms that are involved in this kind of job creation and job destruction kind of effect, if you like. So what we found was that the top three effects on the business of the organization that were reported were to improve the quality of goods and services. We also asked about the quantity, but most people said that it was the quality of goods and services that in particular that had been affected. 37% said that it reduced costs, and 34% said it had increased revenue. And the numbers in red are how much the difference compared to the average for all technologies. So there's a bit more of an effect on the revenue and the improved quality of goods and services compared to other technologies. And we also ask questions about, you know, what happens, what has the effect of the technology been on the jobs of those who are left, essentially. So, and the chart, you can see this in the chart on the right. So they were more likely to say that tasks had become more complicated, that they need more skills and knowledge, that the remaining jobs were more secure, and that people had more control over their hours and task discretion than previously. And there was some were said that there was higher pay for some. So it's not a majority, but there was a higher pay for some. And all of these figures were higher than for the average across any technology. Okay, so just to sum up, essentially, so the findings indicate that AI is affecting jobs, or is appears to be more likely to affect jobs than other technologies. We can't say from our analysis that there's a causal link there, and we can't say to what extent jobs are being created or destroyed. However, it gives us, you know, that using this kind of survey does give us some insights into what's going on, and it gives some ideas about the mechanisms involved, things like what the skills that are affected and what some of the effects on job quality. So, you know, ideas, ways in which future research can kind of try and address some of these questions is, you know, so future surveys, future research could use similar surveys to this to be able to hone in on these kinds of issues. But if they can link to sort of firm level data on employment, or for example, you know, profits or other kind of output measures, we can get a, you know, a stronger indication of what the effects are on organizations. And you can potentially link survey data to firm level data over a longer period of time, so you can see what happens after a few years. Another approach is our survey just focused on the employer side of things, so we surveyed business leaders. So another approach that might potentially give some more insights is to have a sort of matched employer worker survey to sort of triangulate the findings and see whether we're hearing the same things from different perspectives. And the final, not quite the final thing, the penultimate thing to note is that, you know, despite the interest in issues around AI and automation and things like Industry 4.0, that there is in policy circles, even all across Europe, and that these have been an issue for quite a few years. And there's still, so as yet, no official ongoing survey about, you know, that looking at introduction of AI and what the impacts might be on jobs, or any other technology for that matter. There has been one European survey that looked at introduction of you know, investments in AI, but they didn't collect any data on what the impacts on jobs might be. There is, however, just to sort of highlight, there is a survey being carried out at the moment in the field by Digit researchers that should, you know, should provide some results in the coming months, and that survey will be able to, I believe, link into firm level data on some of these things like employment and you know, sort of financial performance. So there's some sort of promising things in the pipeline that might help answer some of these questions. So, and this is just a list of the references, which also can be found in our paper, which was recently published in Research Policy. So thanks a lot. I'll leave it there, open to any questions.
Thank you, Will. Thanks for a fascinating presentation. We're now ready for the Q&A bit of our digit debate. So if you could turn your cameras on, that would be greatly appreciated. Please use the hand function on Zoom, and I will come back to you, or just use the chat function. Well, there is. There is. First hand is there, Jackie.
Thanks very much for that. That was really interesting. I just wanted to ask, how did the CIPD or any employers, have they responded to the findings you presented to them? And if so, what were they interested in, and what do they think of them?
Actually, Chris might be able to say a bit more about this than me, because he's been more plugged in with CIPD. At the time of that we did the survey.
Will, could you take the slides down so it's easier to see you?
Yeah, no problem.
Thanks.
So at the time of the survey, when we finished the survey, the first thing we did was to produce, CIPD wanted a report just to looking at, not just this issue about job creation and job destruction, but a range of different issues. So we produced a report which fed into some wider research that they were doing, which involved some qualitative case studies and things like that. And which resulted in the People and Machines report, which has been out for a couple of years. So most of, they were very interested in all these kinds of questions, but at that time we hadn't done the multivariate analysis. So we would, because of the ways in which these things work, they're keen to get results out there pretty quickly. So that report just focused on the kind of descriptive findings. But I haven't, Chris, have you got anything more to add to that?
No, not really. I mean, Will's right. I mean, we've not had direct employer engagement on this. That was mediated through the CIPD, and they've taken that forward. But as you probably know, the CIPD got a lot of mileage out of it, both with practitioners and with policymakers, and I think they were happy enough, as you know, to think about running a revised version of it, a tweaked version. And I mean, I think one of the things that the feedback I've had anyway from the CIPD is that what they really appreciated was the kind of graft which went in at the front end trying to devise a new technology survey. I mean, as Will's saying at the very end there, it is amazing that there's so much policy debate around the impact of new technology on jobs, and yet there is no database to be able to analyze that. And we're having a similar problem with Beyond 4.0, which is, you want to look at the impact of AI in its various forms on both Industry 4.0 and platform economy, and that data just isn't there. So for us to be able to do that, put the hard graft in at the beginning and get something which possibly might be molded later, was appreciated by the CIPD. And the CIPD then forwarded the survey to the OECD, because they were very cognizant of that kind of data gap, and they were thinking about developing something along those lines. And I don't know what's gone on beyond that with the OECD, but certainly amongst those people who are policymakers in the broadest sense, whether it's at kind of company level like CIPD or governmental level like the OECD, there was a kind of an appreciation of what this had delivered so far. And I think, people who did most of the field work were Sadipa and Will, and they did a great job on that.
Great, thanks, Lord. Sorry, Jackie.
Nobody had a follow up that about us one about if the unions had anything to say about it, but maybe if there's another question first, let's go to somebody else first.
I think since you've asked, I think Will can probably answer.
Yeah, we haven't had any direct feedback from the unions really in terms of this. When we, as in a same kind of way, really, we handed over the first bit of analysis to CIPD, and then they just put that into their wider reports, which went out. So we didn't get any direct feedback from unions on this. And then, you know, as you know, the way things work, you move on to the next project. And then you're looking at something else. So it wasn't until much later, actually, that we were Sadipa and Chris and I were looking at this. I'm trying to think, look, what else, you know, started to look seriously at what else we could do with the data to try and answer these big sort of thorny questions, really. And then obviously that only really came out in the paper only really came out in research policy at the end of last year. So we haven't had any real feedback or input from unions on this. One thing I will say was there was some interesting findings at the bivariate level, where we were just looking at relationships between different variables and the introduction of AI and the effect on jobs. And there was some sort of relationship between whether or not HR were involved and whether or not unions were involved in the discussions about the technology, and they're actually being correlated slightly with more job destruction. And that gives us a difficult question, because does that say that you know, if unions involved, there's going to be more likely to be job destruction, or if HR are involved? But I think, you know, the other way, it could quite easily be the other way around, in that you know, in cases where there were worries that there was going to be a big effect on jobs, the organization spoke to HR and they spoke to the unions and they had some sort of discussion, which is probably more likely, but it wasn't something that we were able to kind of look at in any more detail.
Probably just add a slight caveat to that, which is that the part of a wider discussion at the TUC with a number of unions in the advanced manufacturing sector. They were very aware of the CIPD report, and there was an initiative to try and use this report as the basis for creating some kind of scope and hope, really, for a kind of union partnership in the advanced manufacturing sector, which would try and halt some companies shifting their products onto onto robots, or at least try and attempt to. And as you know, we put in a bid to Digit to be able to lever that and to trigger that. That wasn't successful, and unfortunately the company then made the decision to offshore and abandon that. So I think the TUC was very aware of that, and what the CIPD research gave them in terms of that space to be able to engage with some employers to create alternative futures of work. But directly with unions, it's not been taken forward.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Andreas?
Yes, hello everyone. Thank you very much for your very nice presentation and very interesting one. I wanted to follow up on two issues. One on Chris' response that there's no data out there. I was wondering what's your hunch or what's your insight, whether there is not enough data out there because we're not collecting any, or because some of these announced big large-scale changes haven't happened yet, you know, about the artificial intelligence and the you know, sort of the high-level artificial intelligence. And the second question is also relates sort of to some of the points raised now, that I was wondering, you know, how do we reframe the academic debate from now on, given your survey and where we are with the data. So I was wondering, you know, is there a trade-off between automation and offshoring that is taking place? And, you know, automation might be very expensive at this stage, so offshoring might be preferred still. And, you know, where do we go from here? I mean, if you could elaborate further. Thanks.
Will, shall I take the data one and you the second one?
Sorry.
Yep, go. Yeah.
So Andreas, thanks for the question. Just on the data one, yeah, I mean, one argument would be that we're not picking it up because of a kind of time lag. But I mean, I think the truth is that there are no surveys which are geared up to pick up that kind of information. And I'm thinking European Company Survey, now the European Company Survey, the European Working Conditions Survey have questions which would allow us to, there are questions on, do you use a computer in the workplace, blah, 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 but they're quite limited in that sense. And ironically, same with the Community Innovation Survey, you would think that that would have a whole bank of questions on technology and AI, and it doesn't. There was a labour force survey module that was run in the UK in 2017 and in a number of other countries, which does allow some analysis, but again, we're down to using proxies rather than analysis of AI. And I can point you probably to Natalie Greenham from CANAM in France, and she's written a nice little summary of what is available and what isn't available at certainly the EU level as part of the Beyond 4.0 project. And it's worth getting hold of it if you can from the Beyond 4.0 website.
So, and then Andreas, I didn't quite catch all of your question, but was your question about the relative, was your question that, are we not seeing a stronger effect because of the costs involved in introducing these things, and maybe other things are happening like offshoring at the same time? Was that your question?
Yeah, I mean, my question was, what should we reframe the debate given the early evidence that we have so far of what is going on? Maybe automation is still very expensive, or the high-level artificial intelligence is not there yet, and all these sort of dilemmas, will jobs disappear or not, sort of are sort of part of the debate like 5 years ago. But now that we know a bit more, should we sort of start asking different questions?
Yeah, okay, yeah, I see. So I think I would say that there probably should be some reframing of the debate. I think there's more to it than just, is AI going to replace jobs, or is it going to create jobs? Although those are two important aspects of it. So I think and obviously more research does need to be done on, because of the potential or the concerns about the potential scope, that it does need monitoring and looking at and trying to understand what exactly is going on. So I would say that, I mean, there's a couple of things that come up really in your question. So one of them is, I mean, what we are already seeing, that people are using AI of different types and of differing levels of sophistication, if you like. So it's a bit like the dumb AI to the smart AI kind of concept. And all of them have the potential for some kind of effect on people's jobs or the tasks that are involved. I think there has been an oversimplistic focus on whether jobs are just going to replace humans in the past, and hopefully this is changing a little bit now. And so just to kind of put it in context a little bit, because of some of the other projects I've been working on, which are much more qualitative in nature, so I can give you a couple of examples of recent introductions of AI. So for example, in a large retail organization, we're starting to use a quite sophisticated new changes to the hiring system, which used machine learning to help sort candidates for who might be the best candidate. So there's some stuff actually on the Digit website, actually, a little blog on there that relates to this. But so they were using AI. They were using quite clever AI, like, because they were doing their own machine learning, and there was no intention or even sort of anticipation that it was going to automate the people who were doing the hiring's jobs. They were hoping to kind of help streamline and speed up the process of hiring people, but they weren't hoping to reduce the number of these people because you needed one of them in every store, and they had lots of other things to do, such as scheduling, dealing with sickness, training, all these other kinds of things. So it was changing their jobs, but it wasn't going to destroy their jobs. And then, and going to the kind of other end of the scale, or a nice example that gives some ideas of the mechanisms and the effects, is one of the projects I'm working on at the moment. I've been talking to a manufacturer, doing interviews with people there, and they were using AI to do a specific task. And the idea was that in the future, they wouldn't need so many people doing this specific task. So the number of them would reduce over, hopefully just through natural wastage, if you like, over a period of years. But they wanted to keep hold of some of those people because they needed those skill sets and the knowledge. And they were hoping that because this was going to save some costs, it was going to make things cheaper, and they were hoping that it was going to increase sales or production so that they could actually, so it's a classic example of, you know, some jobs being destroyed here, but jobs being created there through this kind of increased productivity. So it's quite a nice example of that. So there's all these different things going on, and their jobs would change as well, because instead of doing this specific task themselves, they'd be monitoring machines doing the specific task. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot going on. There are more, you know, there are questions about the scope of what high or AI will be able to do. I think at the moment, I think most people are talking about AI being used for specific tasks still. And you know, there are choices about how you use the AI and, you know, what the impact's going to be and how you manage that impact on workers and work, basically.
A quick point of clarification. Yep, sorry.
Please go ahead.
No, Sadipa, you're gone.
Yes, so I just wanted to add to what Will said, to the question that whether we should reframe our question. I would just like to refer one of the current papers where the author is pointing out that you know, it's about harms of AI, and it's not only limited to the job destruction and job elimination, but also how AI is going to impact the market competition, how AI is going to impact the privacy of the consumer, and how it's going to affect the democracy. So it's all about, you know, it's like a lot more than what we are looking at: job destruction, job elimination. So I think that the reframing of the questions has already started.
Thank you. Yeah, Lefteris?
Hello, many thanks for this presentation. I think it's very useful, and I think a lot of new research is going to come about after you publish this research. For example, I was thinking that according to official data reports, like the National AI Strategy, in Britain we have something like more than 1,300 companies which are called AI companies. So obviously we are not talking about job risk there or job elimination, but job creation. But if we look on the statistics more carefully, we will realize that something like 60% of the AI companies in UK are coming from three sectors, like the financial technology, media, entertainment, and advertising. And I think it really makes sense to explore the impact, the intersections with the sector, because I saw that you have, okay, it's about the tasks and the new technology implemented in the workplace, but to be honest, or perhaps I didn't notice that. I mean, you didn't say a lot about the differences across industries, and I think it really matters in my view. Thanks.
Yes, no, totally. And I mean, we did, obviously I mentioned we used industry as a control variable in our analysis. But yeah, I mean, I would expect there to be quite big differences in terms of what technologies they're introducing, what the purpose of those technologies are, and therefore what the potential effect on jobs and you know, the business of the organization is going to be. And yeah, I mean, it's certainly, and obviously our analysis just looks at what happened within the firm. So it didn't look at any kind of secondary effects on other firms in the industry, or whether on, you know, where they were getting their AI from, and any jobs that might be created there. So obviously those are the kinds of things that you would look at in a sort of more macroeconomic way, using sort of different data sets. But there are, you know, as you say, there's lots of different companies springing up, doing different kinds of things that claim either are AI or claim to be AI in different contexts. I remember in one of the presentations I was attending, there was a lot of concern that in some cases a lot of firms were claiming to provide AI solutions, but it wasn't really AI. And then that begs the question of, well, what do you call AI? Is it just the really clever stuff that includes things like machine learning and neural networks, or does it include other things that are more simple, perhaps more kind of encapsulated in what they do, but still appear to be clever or appear to be human in some way? So I think there is, in the past, AI was used to refer to anything that you could be tricked into thinking was human or human-like. To now, some people are starting to be a bit more say, well, that's not really AI. What's really AI is stuff that can learn, or that, you know, has the capability of kind of adjusting itself. So I think there are discussions about, personally, I think it's quite useful to be able to, some would say that machine learning is a subsector of AI, and that, you know, I think it's quite useful to be able to have that, you know, distinguish between the two depending on what specifically you're interested in talking about. But does that answer your question? Or
yes, actually, and it gives me a very good pass actually to say what was my implication earlier on, because I think, for example, the technologies about algorithmic data management in media and advertisement perhaps is not so, if you allow me to say, labor intensive. It's not going to create a lot of jobs, but AI, for example, in agriculture, perhaps something that is going to need more people to look after. That's why I still believe that some kind of exploration of the data, but looking again at the sectoral level, I think it really may matter. So thank you.
Yeah. And of course, there's, just quickly, there's lots of different ways in which use of AI could create jobs as well as destroy jobs, either just directly for those who actually, or have an impact directly for those who actually work with the AI. There's indirectly through the people who create the AI, but also a second indirect effect is if the business is more profitable or whatever and expands, and then more people are hired, then that's a sort of secondary effect, you know, that we've seen in the past for previous waves of automation.
Thank you. Thanks. Before we draw the debate to a close, just would like to draw attention to the next Digit debate. We're taking a week break, and we'll be back on the 30th of March with a debate on how fixing digital divide will help the country level up. You can see the advert now on the screen. So we'll be back on the 30th of March with the next Digit debate. And we'd also like to thank everyone who participated in this debate, particularly our presenters, Chris, Will, Sadipa. Thanks a lot. Are there any last minute questions that people would like to ask? Guess you're welcome to do so. Otherwise, we're looking forward to seeing you at the next Digit debate.